So let me begin with a few disclaimers or a few preliminary remarks. First of all, I very much enjoyed the visit of this college, which was a really very pleasant surprise to see that such things are are created. Second, my topic has been downgraded. I mean, since I have only 20 minutes instead of the 2.5 hours that I expected, I can't talk about translations. I'll talk about one translator and one of his one ego document that he wrote. And the third remark, I will begin somewhat immodestly with an ego document of my own. I will explain in short what are the ego documents that I have studied and why. My trade is that of a historian of science. I have specialized in the history of scientific thought in medieval and Jewish and Arabic cultures. The history of ideas has to be anchored in social realities. We just heard something about it. But where can the historian of medieval thought learn something about the social context of the thought he or she studies? One highway to access social realities are, obviously, ego documents. Highlights by Jewish individuals are possibly the autobiographies of Glückel von Hameln and Salomon Maimon, but they are few and relatively late. For me, 17th, 18th century is late, very late even. For my own needs, I have identified ego documents of a very specific kind, namely prefaces that translators have affixed to their translations. So next time you give this talk, you can add a fourth genre, and probably there are more. Let me say a word on the context. Arabic civilization, including science and philosophy, blossomed from the 8th century onward. Arabophone Jews like Saadia Gaon in the early 10th century and Moses Maimonides in the 12th century partook in this philosophical movement, and as a consequence revolutionized Judaism. But Jews in Europe had no access to Arabic and could access philosophy and science only via Hebrew translations. Such translations began to be done mainly in southern France in the second half of the 12th century. However, the introduction into Jewish culture of this innovative lore met with strong resistance by traditionalists. Conservative circles frowned upon or even vehemently opposed the translating of scientific or philosophical lore into Hebrew, whether from Arabic or from Latin. Hence, translators often wrote prefaces in which they justified the very fact of translating and also exalted the choice of the specific book. These prefaces are often ego documents, which are a mine of information on the contemporary social and intellectual conditions. As a collateral benefit, some ego documents also allow us to establish a sort of personal relationship with the long-deceased author. I will now present one ego document, a sample of what I wanted to talk about, written by a Jewish doctor and translator at the end of the 14th century, and will highlight the wealth of historical and of sociological insights it vehicles. My protagonist is Leon Yosef of Carcassonne, who was born about 1365 in southern France. In 1394, he wrote a remarkable preface to his Hebrew translation of a Latin medical bestseller, Gérard de Solo's Pratica Super Nono al Mansuris. What makes this ego document historically significant is that Leon Yosef, as a participant observer, offers us highly perceptive comparative observations on the study of medicine and of profane science in general in the Jewish and Christian cultural system. He also affords valuable insights into the relationships between Jewish and Christian doctors in his time. I will now review some of the topics so well elucidated by Leon Yosef. Leon Yosef begins by lamenting the low level of instruction of Jews in the sciences, notably in medicine. This is what led him to study with Christians. And now I refer you to the handout. It is extracts from the preface which I edited in Hebrew and translated into English. So those of you who know Hebrew can look at the right side, and those who know English can look at the left side, and those who know both can compare and see where I erred. So the numbering is of the complete text. So we begin with the number 12. Witnessing that the above-mentioned sciences are known among the Christians and their study is formidable and wondrous, I said unto myself, let me learn a little of their tongue and sit in their studia and their house of study and follow in their footsteps, so that I may benefit myself and others by grasping their statements and some of the truth of their books. I must remind you that at that time Jews were not at all admitted at the university. The universities were established something like the 13th century, and at that time, at the end of the 14th century, there were usually no Jews allowed into universities. This began much, much later, and mainly in Italy. Leon Yosef made it and studied medicine at the University of Montpellier. He was one of the very first Jews allowed to do so. Having become familiar with the scholastic university and the science taught and studied there, Leon Yosef now had a privileged vantage point from which to observe the Jewish society. He identified various causes for the manifest Christian superiority in science and medicine. One of them has to do with the fact that the rank and file Jews believe the profane sciences to be incompatible with the Jewish tradition. And those of you who know Israel well know that this issue, whether the Jewish tradition is in contradiction with science and philosophy, is so alive in Jewish culture today. This is what is called in Hebrew the issue of the limudei liba, which are so vehemently rejected by many of the Haredi Jews. So this has its origins already in the 12th century. In Jewish society, Leon Yosef goes on to explain, the students of science and philosophy are under constant surveillance and pressure of the traditionalists. Consequently, and this is his main point, no public teaching of science could be instituted. He writes, and this is the next paragraph, 6, even those few who inquire into the sciences were forced to do this in secret and hidden away. They were not allowed to teach the rationalist science in the marketplaces and in the streets, nor to discuss it or to set up a public place of study. Leon Yosef here refers to the absence of institutionalization of the teaching of science among Jews as a cause for the Jewish scientific backwardness. A modern sociologist of science cannot but applaud the insightfulness of this observation. The absence of perennial structures in which science is transmitted from masters to students, where scientific thought is cumulative from one generation to the next, and where the beginners are socialized into scientific method by the elder, is a sine qua non for the advancement of science. But there is even more to it. Leon Yosef discerningly notes that the social structure of science also has an impact on its very method. Specifically, the institutionalization of science teaching in the medieval Faculty of Arts was intrinsically bound up with the practice of the scholastic method, which Leon Yosef views as a most efficient tool in furthering knowledge. He writes of the Christian scholars, and this is paragraph 13, they cunningly argue over the truth of the sciences, even by positing falsehoods. In their disputations, they are painstakingly rigorous in their questions and answers, so as to extract the truth from the center of its contrary by examining two contraries of everything, like a lily among the thorns. Leon Youssef clearly refers to the use of the Quaestio Disputata that developed during the second half of the 13th century. The topic was presented in the form of a quaestio, for which the master then presented arguments both pro and con a given solution. A detailed scrutiny of the arguments followed, and then concluded by a determinatio. On some occasions, questions were debated publicly. The quaestio was at the very heart of the scholastic method, and once a method of inquiry and of teaching, at once a method of inquiry and teaching, and it played an important role in the advancement of knowledge as then perceived. Leon Youssef adduces a resourceful rhetorical argument that followed the aim of legitimizing his undertaking vis-à-vis the traditionalist opponents of science and philosophical study. He argues that the rabbis of the Talmud had already employed precisely this method of positing the contrary, so that it is particularly deplorable that at present Jews do not use it. Leon Youssef, we see, admires both the mode of institutionalization of science practiced by Christians and the resulting contents. This is what had brought him to the university in the first place. And he writes, this is paragraph 20, I thus followed in the footsteps of the Christian sages, and they directed me to the right path, showed me the ways, and revealed to me the books, both new and old. We learn en passant that Christian doctors often challenge Jewish physicians in disputations, precisely the method they, but not the Jews, studied and practiced at the university. Leon Youssef thus writes that his Hebrew translations of Gerard's work will enable the Jewish doctor, and this is paragraph 23, to stand like a fortified pillar, not fearing anything, not even myriads of the community of Christian physicians, if they were to confront him with experiences and disputations. He therefore reckons that in the future, the users of his translations will bless him inasmuch as, paragraph 26, I will be the cause of their subsistence and their capability to hold their ground in the face of the Christian physicians who challenge them with experience and disputations. Leon Youssef makes a few further interesting observations on social relations. One of them is that, in general, Christians despise Jews, except if they are good physicians. And he writes, this is paragraph 16, I lived among them, the Christians, for a long time, and was lowly considered. No one of our nation is respectable in their eyes unless he is a physician who cures them of their illnesses. Such a physician, however, sits at the table of kings and is admitted to their presence. In this generally unfriendly or even hostile Christian environment, Leon Youssef was particularly sensitive to marks of a more cordial attitude towards him. He has very warm words for Jean de Tournemire, who lived from about 1330 to 1390, who in the 1370s was a physician to the popes in Avignon, and from 1384 was Chancellor of the University of Montpellier. He writes, and this is paragraph 25, in his days he was the head, that is the Chancellor, of all the scholars of Montpellier. I saw him with my own eyes and talked with him. In his conversation he was righteous, his manner was not like that of the scholars of his generation, namely to humiliate the Jew who practice the art of medicine. Leon Joseph concludes this paragraph on Tournemire with the words, "May his soul be bound in the band of life of the righteous of the world's nations. תהי נשמתו צרורה בצרור חיי חסידי אומות העולם." Such a blessing for the soul of a Gentile, even a righteous one, is exceedingly rare. It bespeaks Leon Joseph's deep gratefulness towards Jean de Tournemire, who stooped to talk gently to a young Jew seeking to acquire the best available education on his route to becoming a doctor. More generally, it reflects a non-confrontational attitude towards Christian society, and it well illustrates the general tendency of Jewish doctors for a rapprochement with Christian society and individuals. More than 600 years after the event, it makes me think of Leon Joseph with much empathy and even tenderness. Let me conclude with a few words on the general social setting within which Leon Joseph and his ego document have to be set. As already stated, between the 12th and the end of the 14th century, the secular sciences were intensively naturalized and studied in Provence, and the study of profane discipline among Jews was grounded in Hebrew translations of Arabic texts. Very remarkably, only few philosophical scientific texts were translated from Latin, and also the oral intellectual exchanges between Jewish and Gentile scholars were scarce. But there was one intellectual domain in which interactions between Jews and Christians were relatively intensive from an early date on. This is medicine. In the early 13th century and again the 14th century, Jewish physicians were abreast of Latin medicine, both through personal interactions and through Latin into Hebrew translations of medical works. The reason for this medical exception, as we may call it, is quite obvious. Patients will generally tend to seek the best possible medical treatment, an unvarying datum of human nature that inexorably put the Jewish doctors in constant and direct competition with the environing non-Jewish health system. At each given place, medicine was a unified knowledge system in which Jewish doctors were compelled to keep up with the tendencies of medicine in the majority culture. This created a constant impulse to remain up to date. During most of the 13th century, Jewish physicians could rely on the advanced Arabic works of medicine or their Hebrew translations. However, in the 14th century, as in all periods of rapid change in Latin medicine, they were under pressure to appropriate the new doctrines of university-based Latin medicine. The dynamics of knowledge transfer in medicine were propelled by continuous encounters, some friendly, some adverse, between Jewish and Christian doctors, and were therefore independent, often different from those operative in science and philosophy. Leon Joseph's eyewitness account makes it clear how this social pressure shaped the Jewish attitude to the Christian knowledge system. But there is also another side to this medal. As a result of their social contacts with the Gentile social environments, Jewish doctors were acquainted with Christian culture more so than most other Jewish intellectuals. Their special vantage point allowed them to critically compare their own culture with that of the majority, and possibly perceive the latter's positive sides, not the least of which was the ever more advanced world of learning. This is what made Jewish doctors into a social group particularly prone to conversion. Statistical data collected by Richard Emery for Perpignan in the 14th century has clearly established that within the elite groups, it does seem evident that physicians tended more towards conversion and less to exile than the others. It will thus not come as a surprise to learn that a few years after having made his translation and written his preface, Leon Joseph ended up by taking baptism, adopting the name Leonardus Benedictus. Clearly, his conversion is intimately linked with the web of interaction with the Christian culture, the studies at the university, the practice as a doctor, and the role as a go-between the Christian and Jewish cultures. Thank you very much.